We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The U.S. national debt continues to expand. Is there an end in sight? And is there a solution on the horizon? We're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's economics editor, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. And, right away, you can just end this program. There is no solution. It's only going to get worse.
I disagree. And I'm going to blow your mind with my...
okay, blow my mind.
I've read, precisely... How many books have I read on economics? I haven't read any. However, I'm a thinking man. And I think a thinking creature can always come up with a solution to a problem. So, Andrew, let's get the facts of the U.S. national debt out in the open first. What are we looking at? 35 trillion thereabouts by the end of this year?
Yeah. Well, no. End of this year, it's already at 35 trillion. End of the year, it's going to be 36 trillion at the end of the year.
So wait. How much are we adding? How much is the U.S. adding over, let's say, 6 months?
It's about $1 trillion every 6 months. Yes.
$1 trillion every 6 months. So, okay. Well, that's
the U.S. government 200 years to get to its first trillion, and now it takes the U.S. government about 6 months to add $1 trillion.
Einstein said nothing quite as powerful as cumulative interest. I think you should have a look at the national debt spending. Although part of that is cumulative interest, I would argue.
Yes. You got to mention this, yes.
So let's talk about that. So you've got an extra $1 trillion every 6 months. What does that work out at in terms of... Now, here's what I love. It's what I hate, actually, but you know the expression. How much does that work out per person in the United States? How much does each person in the United States owe because of the government spending?
It's at least $100,000, but per taxpayer, it's about $230,000.
I mean, that's a worrying figure in itself, isn't it, Andrew?
Yes.
But I mean, sure, we don't expect 5-year-olds to be paying income tax on their lemonade stand, although
they will. The way the government is running right now, the way finances are, they will eventually tax lemonade stands.
So you've got this situation. So per taxpayer, $230,000 roughly is, yes. And I hate to use the term, is owed by, but as far as the government's concerned, that taxpayer is earmarked for $230,000 of payments, right? As long as they live long enough, they're earmarked for $230,000 worth of payments, which of course won't go into paying off the debt. It will just go to pay for the next things. But, and this is going to sound like a terribly stupid question, Andrew, but the US dollar is the chief currency in the world, and the US seems to be able to print dollars whenever it wants.
You're going there. Jared Bernstein territory here.
Come on, tell me why that situation is wrong. I do know that it's wrong, but tell me why.
Because that would result in hyperinflation. If the U.S. government were to just print its way and to print another $15 trillion to cover the remaining, just to cover domestic, because remember, you have two levels of debt. You have the debt owed by the American people, and then you have debt owed by foreigners. So let's say, the debt owed by the people is around $28 trillion, and then about $8 trillion with foreigners. So if you just covered it's $27 trillion, you'd have hyperinflation. So the U.S. government just taps into the capital markets and borrows from investors in order to just maintain the current level of spending and interest payments, not to pay down the national debt or, to cover future spending, to cover current spending now. So that's why the government doesn't just print its own money. Although you could make the case that the Federal Reserve already monetizes the national debt through the purchasing of Treasury securities.
That's actually what I was coming to. Yeah, you saw where I was going with that. So you have these funds being raised by these Treasury bonds. Now, isn't that just? It's almost like a canard, isn't it? It's something it's got to collapse in on itself.
Well, this is the problem that's going on right now. So, there's a few things here. So right now, the Federal Reserve has been trimming its balance sheet, which a lot of is comprised of Treasury debt securities. Yeah. It's been lowering this, so it lowered it in March 2022. It's about $7 trillion now, the balance sheet. It announced a couple of months ago that it would reduce the amount of tapering of Treasury securities from 60 billion to 25 billion. Their argument is that it allows them to trim their holdings without creating chaos in the financial markets. Now here's the funny part of it is that this is creating a situation where it's stealth QE because now they're lowering
QE
their
being quantitative easing.
yes, quantitative easing. Because the U.S. government can now sell more T-bills to the financial markets without creating higher yields because now the Federal Reserve is holding on to more bonds. So that was the whole point of it. So a lot of people are accusing, including Republican senators, Janet Yellen, of manipulating the markets doing this.
It's a fascinating.
One more thing too.
Sure.
Sorry, when it comes to borrowing, the new Treasury borrowing funding estimates shows that the U.S. government is going to borrow about $1 trillion over the next 6 months, and it's going to focus primarily on short-term debt securities. What is interesting about this 6-month outlook is that the cash balance is about $700 billion. Investors are paying very close attention to this number because so in a couple of months, guess what's going to happen? Debt ceiling negotiations yet again. And if this thing prolongs, then the Treasury will once again have to tap into the TGA, the Treasury General Account, and you're going to have all these things again. You're going to have, the credit downgrades again by Moody's. You're going to have, chaos in the Treasury markets. It maybe exacerbate current conditions in the equities arena. So that was a very underreported report from the Treasury.
Well, let's stick with what's going to be happening on Capitol Hill in terms of trying to keep the government lights on. There's nobody really proposing. Obviously, there's an election coming up just around the corner. I don't know if you heard about it. Some people think it's going to be important. I'm not so sure. But in terms of the national debt, is it going to be an important election? And if I may just put my admittedly uneducated position out there, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference who wins in terms of the national debt.
Yeah, absolutely. I have no disagreement with you there. You saw under Trump, he worsened the fiscal conditions. Kamala Harris has no issue whatsoever with spending more money. So the things, it doesn't matter who wins. Whoever wins, the national debt loses. And you see these spending programs from the current administration and the previous one. Nobody tackled whatsoever the national debt. And you mentioned earlier about cumulative payments. Right now, under the Congressional Budget Office's estimate, which is a rosy outlook, mind you, $13 trillion in cumulative interest payments over the next decade. Now, what happens if there's a recession, if there's, a war, if there's another pandemic that requires more government spending, more government taking on debt, so you could have potentially even higher interest payments, cumulative ones, over this decade outlook.
Andrew, final point for me. You have this situation where more and more of the, let's call it, I'm doing the inverted quotes, government money is going to be used to finance the debt that the government incurs. Doesn't that mean that at some point it's going to have to be services that are provided by the government that are cut back on?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just Social Security alone, once the reserve is exhausted and there's not enough money to cover the payments, there's automatically under legislation a 20% cut to benefits. But the issue with government spending is not so much the non-discretionary, it's the mandatory spending that accounts for at least 2/3 of all the outlays. So you can cut unimportant spending, but you still gonna have that giant black hole of the mandatory spending and the interest payments. You look at the 10-year outlook from the CBO, $7 trillion mandatory spending out of a $10 trillion or $10.4 trillion budget by 2034. That's unsustainable. But no one's willing to tackle that because it includes things like Social Security and Medicare.
It's the only time sustainability is mentioned in Washington, D.C., and people run for miles. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That is just about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to mention that Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. My thanks today to our special guests, national correspondent John Clark, economist Andrew Moran, and national security correspondent Dave Patterson. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners out there who tune in to the show each and every week. I'd like to leave you with the words of Henry Ford, who said, "If money is your hope for independence, you'll never have it. The only real security that a man will have in this world is a reserve of knowledge, experience, and ability." So No matter how dark times seem for the economy, food security, and even national security, I think Mr. Ford has a point. It is through the better recreation of ourselves, through gaining new knowledge, gaining new experiences, and testing our abilities, that we can better weather the storms of outside events. Wise words, I think. Thank you for listening.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.